Imagine walking past a man on the subway every single day. He's tall, he's quiet, maybe a little bit clunky, just another face in the crowd of millions. You wouldn't look twice at him. Why would you? He's wearing a suit, carrying a briefcase, maybe looking a bit tired. In a place like New York City, that man is the definition of invisible. But what if I told you that the quiet, unremarkable guy standing right next to you was living a double life that would eventually shock the entire country? If you want to stay updated on the facts and the latest breakthroughs in this case, make sure to subscribe to Top Crime Cases right now. For over 30 years, Rex Heuermann was a respected architect in Manhattan. He helped New York City officials audit building codes. He was the guy you hired if you had a complex construction project and needed someone who knew every corner of the bureaucracy. But in the suburbs of Long Island, Heuermann was working on a different kind of project. He used that same structural precision to build a wall between his life as a husband and father and his actions in the dark. He wasn't some criminal mastermind living in a secret bunker. He was hiding in plain sight, using a suburban commute and a mundane professional identity to mask his activities. Rex Heuermann founded RH Consultants and Associates on Fifth Avenue. If you looked at his professional life, it was standard. He was a 6'4" man who walked the city streets, attended meetings, and helped clients deal with zoning permits. He was, by all accounts, unmemorable. That was his greatest asset. In a city like New York, a man in a suit carrying a briefcase is invisible. People walked past him on the street, sat in meetings with him, and saw a professional. They didn't see the person he became when he left the city. We have to talk about who he was away from the office. Transitioning to his home life in Massapequa Park, the scene was different. He lived at 105 First Avenue. To his neighbors, it was just an older, somewhat cluttered house. It wasn't the kind of place you'd think someone was doing anything other than living a quiet, suburban life. He lived there with his wife, Asa Ellerup, and his stepson. For years, the house served as a place of domestic stability. Now, I need to be very clear about something. There is no evidence that his family was involved in or aware of his crimes. Police investigators and court records show they were frequently out of state or out of the country when these murders occurred. Heuermann used his time when his family was away as a logistical window. He didn't have to sneak around his own house. He just had to wait for the house to be empty. Let's shift the focus to the people who were at the center of this tragedy. We need to remember them as people, not just as evidence in a file. The Gilgo Four, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes, were not just names on a list. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was 25 when she went missing in 2007. She was a mother, and people who knew her described her as kind and vibrant. She was from Connecticut and was trying to make ends meet. When she disappeared, it left a massive hole in the lives of her family. Melissa Barthelemy was only 24. She was from Erie, New York, and moved to the city. Her friends said she wanted to be a hairdresser. She was young, full of life, and she was someone who was dearly loved. When she vanished in 2009, her family didn't stop looking for her. Megan Waterman was 22. She was a young mother from Maine. She loved her daughter more than anything. Those who knew her said she was bright and had a lot of hopes for her future. She was only in New York for a short time when she disappeared in 2010. Amber Costello was 27. She was from North Carolina. She was struggling, but she was a person with dreams and family who cared about her. She was a daughter and a sister. These women were independent, and they operated through Craigslist to keep themselves safe. That was the reality of the time, using online platforms to find work and stay in control of their safety. Heuermann didn't target them by chance. He created an operational grid. He used burner phones. This wasn't just a random act. It was a calculated procedure. According to the district attorney's office, he kept these phones in specific zones near his Manhattan office and parts of Long Island. He was careful. He would turn the phones off before returning home. This effectively created a digital blackout. He wasn't connecting his domestic life to his hunting grounds. He applied the same logic to these crimes as he did to his building projects. Identify the load-bearing requirements, minimize the footprint, and ensure the structure remains standing. Heuermann chose the area of Ocean Parkway for a reason. He was a local. He knew the geography of the marshland, the overgrown brush, and the secluded nature of Gilgo Beach. It was a place where a person could stop a vehicle, walk a short distance, and disappear into the environment, all within a geography he was intimately familiar with. You have to look at how he handled his day-to-day life to understand how he kept this up for so long. He was the kind of person who checked boxes. If you're an architect, you know that if you miss a detail in a building code, the whole thing gets rejected. He treated his life like that. He attended community meetings in Massapequa Park. He paid his taxes. He did the things a normal guy does. The house on First Avenue is a perfect example of his double life. When the police eventually searched it, they found it was in a state of disrepair. It was packed with clutter. It didn't look like the home of a successful Manhattan architect. It looked like the home of someone who was preoccupied with other things. But to the neighbors, it was just the house of the guy who worked in the city. Nobody looked twice. He relied on the fact that society tends to ignore the unmemorable. He was a big guy, 6'4", but he didn't draw attention to himself in a way that people remembered. When he worked, he was focused on building codes and zoning. When he was on the phone, he was focused on his project. The police later said that his methods were consistent. He used Craigslist to set up meetings. He picked locations that were isolated. He used burner phones that he thought were untraceable. He thought he was smarter than the system. He thought that as long as he kept his two worlds from touching, he would be safe. But even the best architect eventually runs into a problem they didn't account for. They call it a load-bearing failure. Heuermann kept his life as a suburban husband and his life as a predator in two different silos. He thought he had built a wall so thick that nothing could get through it. He lived like this for over a decade. He went to work, he paid for his kids' expenses, he ate dinner, he slept, all while knowing exactly what he had done. The thing is, human beings aren't buildings. You can't just seal off a part of your life and expect it to stay there forever. There are always cracks. There's always a footprint left behind. Think about the victims' families during those years. For over a decade, they didn't know what happened. They were left with questions, with grief, and with a lack of closure. The police were trying to solve the case, but they were missing the connection. They were looking for a monster in the shadows, but they didn't realize the monster was just a guy commuting on the train, wearing a suit and carrying his lunch. Heuermann's methodology was based on control. He controlled the time, he controlled the location, he controlled the communication. He thought he could manipulate the environment just like he manipulated building permits. But the problem with his approach was that it relied on no one noticing him. And for a long time, nobody did. When you look at the map of where these things happened, you can see why he chose it. It was dark, it was remote, and it was close to where he lived. He didn't have to travel far. He could commit these acts and be back in his home before his family even knew he had left. That's the part that is really hard to process, the ability to compartmentalize. The police have stated that he used his knowledge of the area to his advantage. He knew the back roads, he knew where the cameras weren't, he knew where the police patrols were. He was using his everyday knowledge as a tool. But we have to remember, this wasn't a movie. This was real life. These were real people who lost their lives. And for years, the only thing that kept him going was the silence of those around him and his own ability to keep his secrets buried. It is important to understand that his perfect blueprint was failing, even if he didn't know it yet. He was leaving digital breadcrumbs. He was leaving phone records. He was interacting with people who would eventually become witnesses, even if they didn't know it at the time. He thought his structure was permanent. He thought he had designed a life that was invincible. But the thing about secrets is that they take a lot of energy to keep. He had to be perfect every single day. He had to be perfect with his phone usage. He had to be perfect with his alibis. He had to be perfect with his behavior. And nobody is perfect forever. The irony is that his professional training, the thing he used to justify his own sense of intelligence, was the same mindset that eventually led to his downfall. He was so focused on the structure of his deceit that he didn't notice the foundation was rotting beneath him. As we move forward into how the system eventually caught up with him, remember that it wasn't just about one lucky break. It was about the slow, methodical work of investigators who finally started to see the same thing we are seeing now, that the guy in the suit wasn't an architect of buildings. He was just a man hiding in the wreckage of his own life. This was his world. This was his project. And for a long time, it was the only thing that mattered to him. But the victims, they mattered to everyone else. And they are the reason why, eventually, the wall he built came crashing down. We're going to see how that happened step by step as we move into the next part of this. It's a story of how even the most carefully constructed lives can unravel when the truth finally comes out. We aren't here to judge his family. We aren't here to judge the victims. We are here to look at the facts. And the facts show that Rex Heuermann lived a life that was built on a lie. And eventually that lie became too heavy for him to carry. In 2010, the search for Shannan Gilbert led police to the marshes of Ocean Parkway. It was winter, and the environment was unforgiving. When investigators were searching that stretch of land, they weren't expecting to find a graveyard. But that is what they found. It's important to stay grounded in the facts here. While the search for Shannan was the reason police were in that specific area, the official reports and the autopsy concluded that Shannan Gilbert's death was an accidental drowning in the marsh, not a homicide linked to the serial killer cases. I know that's a point of confusion for a lot of people, but that is what the records state. The discovery of the other 4 women, the Gilgo 4, changed everything. For the families of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes, the nightmare was just beginning. It is hard to imagine what they went through, waiting for answers that didn't come for over a decade. The investigation stalled. You hear people ask all the time, why did it take so long? The truth is, it wasn't just one thing. It was a mix of factors. First, we have to look at the technology. In 2010, the forensic tools available to local police were not what they are today. Mitochondrial DNA testing, which is used to analyze degraded samples, was in its early stages for a case of this magnitude. And when it comes to cell tower mapping, in 2010, that tech wasn't precise enough to tell you exactly where a person was standing on a street corner. You couldn't pinpoint a location down to a specific block or building the way we can now. But there was also the issue of institutional friction. That's the diplomatic way to say that the different agencies involved weren't playing well together. The Suffolk County Police Department, under the administration of former Chief James Burke, was dealing with internal stagnation. There was a lack of coordination between the local police and the FBI. There was actually a piece of evidence sitting right in the database. A witness had described a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche leaving the scene. A local resident who fit the physical description of the suspect drove that exact truck, but the link remained unmade. For 13 years, that crucial piece of data just sat there, unused. Meanwhile, Rex Heuermann went on with his life. He continued to file permits, he attended community meetings, and he lived his daily routine. He was operating under the assumption that his structure, his wall of secrecy, was permanent. He assumed that because nobody had knocked on his door in 2010, nobody ever would. Why not subscribe to Top Crime Cases to keep up with the facts? We're breaking down the full investigation, and you don't want to miss the conclusion. The shift didn't happen until February 2022, when a new multi-agency task force was formed. This was the stress test for Heuermann's secret life. The investigators on this task force didn't come in with any assumptions. They went back to the original case notes from 2010. They treated the files like a cold case that needed fresh eyes. They looked at that old witness description of the Chevrolet Avalanche and decided to run it against current vehicle registration data. And that's when it hit. The car belonged to Rex Heuermann. It was a simple, old-school investigative move, but it broke the seal. Once they had the vehicle, they started to put pressure on the foundation of his double life. They didn't just rely on the car. They used modern, high-precision cell tower data. This is where it gets interesting. They were able to triangulate the signals from his burner phones with the location of his personal phone. What they found was a pattern. They could see that When the burner phones were active in specific areas, near the locations where victims were found or where he was allegedly making his moves, his personal phone was either off or sitting in a location that was at work or at home. He thought he was being clever by keeping his phone separate, but the metadata showed a clear, suspicious pattern. He was creating his own digital breadcrumbs. He just didn't realize it at the time. Then came the forensic breakthrough that really closed the loop. This wasn't a high-speed chase or a dramatic shootout. It was surveillance. During a surveillance operation in Manhattan, undercover investigators were watching Heuermann's every move. They wanted DNA evidence that was undeniable. They watched him dispose of a pizza box and a trash can outside his office. He didn't even know they were there. The investigators waited until he was gone. They retrieved the box and they took it to the lab. They pulled a DNA profile from a crust. It was a match. The male hair found on the remains of Megan Waterman was his. The wall he had built was finally cracking. This moment is significant because it highlights the difference between the investigation in 2010 and the one in 2022. It wasn't just about better computers. It was about persistence and the right strategy. The police said the investigation was successful because they followed the evidence step by step rather than trying to force a theory. From the perspective of the defense, they had to deal with the reality of this forensic evidence. There isn't much room to argue when your DNA is found on a victim. That's why when we look at how the case progressed, we see a shift. The prosecution had the physical link, the vehicle link, and the digital link. The structure he had built was failing, and there was no way to repair it. It's important to talk about the victims here. Megan Waterman was just 22. She was a mother. She was someone's daughter. When the police matched that DNA, they weren't just getting a conviction. They were finally getting answers for families who had spent over a decade wondering what happened to their loved ones. The police have stated that this evidence was the turning point. It didn't just give them a suspect. It gave them the ability to prove who was responsible for these crimes. They could finally link the man who was filing zoning permits in Manhattan to the man who was active in the marshes of Ocean Parkway. It is a sobering thought. A man could live his life in such a way, hiding in plain sight, and believe he had gotten away with it for so long. He thought he was smarter than the system. He thought he knew how to hide the load-bearing parts of his life. But he underestimated the ability of law enforcement to go back, look at the old data, and connect the dots. As we look at the results of the 2022 task force, it's clear that the combination of old school investigation like tracking the vehicle and new school technology like the DNA and cell tower data was what finally exposed him. The stress test worked. The system, which had failed for 13 years due to internal issues and tech limitations, finally functioned the way it was supposed to. When you look at this part of the story, it's not just about the capture of a man. It's about the fact that no matter how well you think you've hidden your tracks, there is almost always a record left behind. Whether it's a car registration, a cell tower signal, or a piece of DNA on a pizza crust, the truth has a way of surfacing. For the victims' families, this was the beginning of the end of the uncertainty. For the law enforcement officers, this was the result of thousands of hours of work going back to the basics and refusing to give up on a case that everyone else had decided was cold. The wall didn't just crack, it fell. And what lay behind it was a reality that was even more difficult in the silence they had lived with for 13 years. We are now heading into the final act, where the silence finally broke and the accountability began. The arrest happened in July 2023 on a sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan. It was quiet. It wasn't a chase or a standoff. It was a simple apprehension. Heuermann was just walking, living his life, seemingly unaware that the net had finally closed around him. For the people who saw it happen, it might have looked like any other police encounter. But for the investigators who had been tracking him, this was the end of a long, difficult road. It wasn't the end of the story, though. It was only the beginning of the legal process. Following his arrest, the forensic search of his Massapequa Park home was extensive. It wasn't just a quick walkthrough. It was a methodical, weeks-long operation. Investigators had been looking at his public life for years, but now they were forced to look at his personal environment. We have to talk about what they found. When the media reported on the state of that house, it was striking. It was cluttered, filled with items, and in a state of disrepair. It didn't look like the home of a high-end Manhattan architect. It looked like the home of a man who was deeply disconnected from his surroundings. As the investigation expanded, the charges against him grew. Police said the evidence linked him to more lives than they first realized. He was eventually indicted for the murders of Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, and Sandra Castilla. Each of these women had families who had been waiting for answers for years. Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, and Sandra Castilla were human beings with lives, hopes, and people who loved them. The expansion of the charges was a heavy moment for everyone involved. Then the case reached its legal conclusion on April 8, 2026. This was a massive shift in the courtroom. Rex Heuermann, who had maintained a not guilty plea for so long, entered a plea deal. He went from denying the charges to pleading guilty to 7 counts of murder. And then there was the admission regarding an 8th victim, Karen Vergata. When you look at the terms of that deal, they were absolute. He accepted multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. There was no wiggle room. In exchange for this, he agreed to cooperate with the FBI. Following the plea, Heuermann provided details about his methods. This is the part that is difficult to process, but we have to look at the facts. He admitted to using the basement in his Massapequa Park home as a controlled environment, what he referred to as a kill room, during the times his family was away. This admission provided the final grim piece of the puzzle for law enforcement. It explained how he was able to maintain his double life. As of right now, he is awaiting his formal sentencing, which is scheduled for June 17th, 2026 at the Riverhead Court. This outcome has triggered several legal and public debates. It's important that we look at these debates without picking a side, because there are valid points on both sides of the argument. The first debate is about the plea deal itself. Why would the justice system accept a plea deal instead of going to trial? If you ask the prosecution and the families of the victims, they'll tell you that a trial is a traumatic, years-long process. It would have forced the families to relive every detail over and over again in a public courtroom. The plea deal guarantees he will never leave prison. There's no chance of an appeal that could overturn the conviction. It also forces his cooperation, which is valuable for the FBI to help them close other cold cases. But if you look at it from the perspective of some legal experts and members of the public, they argue that a public trial was necessary. A trial would have forced every piece of evidence onto the official record under oath. It would have laid bare the extent of the institutional failures that allowed him to operate for 13 years. They argue that transparency is the only way to ensure the system is held accountable. So you have the comfort of the families and the certainty of the outcome on one side and the need for public accountability on the other. Both points are valid. The second debate is about the 13-year delay. This is where a lot of frustration lies. People ask, was this a technical limitation or a failure of the system? We know that technologically, tools improved between 2010 and 2022. That's a fact. But we also know that the Chevy Avalanche, which was a key piece of evidence, was sitting in the police database since 2010. It was right there. A witness had provided the description, and the vehicle was registered to a man living in the area who fit the description. The failure to cross-reference that simple data point for over a decade is a significant point of criticism. Police and administrators have been forced to answer for this, and it remains a glaring example of how institutional oversight can break down. It wasn't just that the technology wasn't there. It was that the basic investigation didn't connect the dots that were already in front of them. The third point of debate is the cooperation clause. As part of the plea deal, Heuermann is now required to speak with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Critics argue that a serial killer like Heuermann is pathologically manipulative. They say he'll use these interviews to feed his own ego, lie to investigators, or provide false leads just to stay relevant while he's sitting in a cell for the rest of his life. They argue it's a waste of time. On the other hand, criminologists and law enforcement professionals say there is utility here. They believe that even a manipulative person can provide data points that help them build better profiles for future cases. It's about understanding the how and the why so that they can stop the next one. They argue that getting any information is better than getting nothing at all. It's a gamble, but one that authorities felt was worth taking. When you look back at the whole story, the architectural analogy really does hold up. He built a structure designed to last. He used his professional training to create a load-bearing wall between his domestic life and his crimes. He used burner phones, he used his knowledge of the geography, and he used his status as an unmemorable middle-class guy to avoid suspicion. He thought his structure was permanent, but he left a flaw in the foundation. He assumed that the system would stay as it was in 2010. He didn't account for the fact that time moves forward, technology evolves, and eventually a new set of eyes would look at the data he thought was buried. The investigators found that flaw, they pulled at the loose thread, and the entire structure collapsed. We have to remember that throughout this entire process, while we talk about structural failures and forensic breakthroughs, there were real lives lost. There were families who spent over a decade in silence, waiting for someone to finally see what was happening. When the wall fell, it didn't just expose a man. It exposed the reality of a decade-long tragedy. As we reach the conclusion of this documentary, it's worth thinking about what we've learned. It's not just about how one man hid in plain sight. It's about the importance of persistence in the justice system. It's about how even the most complex, well-hidden lies eventually come to light when people refuse to give up. Rex Heuermann is now facing the consequences of his actions. The families have in some way received the closure they were waiting for. The legal system has processed the case. But the questions about why it took so long and how he was able to walk free for those 13 years will likely remain a part of this story for a long time. Heuermann thought he was the architect. He thought he was the one in control. But in the end, it was the evidence, the facts, and the determination of those who refused to let the case go that truly decided his fate.